Good afternoon. I'm John Hart, the co-founder of C3 Solutions and the executive editor of our news magazine, C3. Welcome to our Clean Energy Week webinar on younger Americans' attitudes towards climate and energy issues. And joining me today is a terrific panel. It includes Kat Dwyer. Welcome, Kat. Kat's the marketing and media manager at the organization Property and Environmental Research Center, otherwise known as PERC, and she's the host of the Whiskey Bench podcast, and her writings have appeared in National Review, the Washington Examiner, the National Interest, and more. And also Jeff Luse, my colleague at C3 Solutions. He's our policy assistant. And Jeff's work has been featured in National Review, Town Hall, Nuclear Energy, of course, our news magazine, and other places as well. And then finally, Ben Khoshbin. He's the Energy and Environment Fellow with the American Conservation Coalition, ACC, and he's also with Young Voices. Ben's appeared in the Daily Caller, the National Interest, and Real Clear Energy. So again, all three of you, thank you so much for taking the time. This is a really fascinating topic, and I know that you all have a lot of insights on it. Just to kind of set this up is, one of the benefits of being somewhat older than the younger voices is I've seen, politics change over the years. And oftentimes we make a mistake, I think, in sort of analysis, and we describe voters as a base. And I think the word base is a bit of a misnomer because it implies that the foundation's fixed and it's not going to change. But the reality is that politics is always changing. It isn't so much a base as it is a rock pile where you slowly move things over time. And there are shifting alliances, shifting focuses, and sometimes we move backwards, sometimes we move forward. So I think it's really important to really have a vision of where you want to go within your organizations. And so you all have great insights on that. So maybe we'll just kind of start with you, Kat. What do you think young voters are looking for candidates, in 2022 on this issue of climate and clean energy? What's most important?
Well, I think young voters are looking for real solutions. A 2020 poll found that some 80% of young voters view climate change as an existential threat to life on Earth. And I might argue that concern is slightly overblown considering the actual data, but clearly this is an issue that motivates this age group. And again, they're looking for real solutions, and they've really for most of their lives been given a message of climate doomism that is really disheartening and doesn't offer real solutions. So I think they are looking for not just to be told that the solution is to give politicians more money and more power. Frankly, I don't think most young people actually have much faith in our political system. So I think there's actually a really great opportunity for kind of innovative leaders to step forward with a message of optimism and to put forth policy ideas that actually help us adapt to a changing climate while maintaining economic prosperity.
Yeah. Now, do you think you mentioned that there's a lot of climate doom and gloomism? So that's, just frankly, that's one of the big divides, I think, generationally between older voters. I'm Generation X, so we're a bit of a translator generation between the boomers and folks your age. But there's a lot of eye rolling. There's a lot of just sighs and exasperation when people get into the alarmist language for people my generation and older. But I think for younger people, it's almost a given and an assumption. But I think there is a misalignment, I think, in the electorate where you have politicians like AOC have assumed that because there's a high level of concern, there's also an automatic buy-in to a very socialistic command and control top down. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit more in your generation. Do you find that those voters are up for grabs, so to speak, that there's more open-mindedness than people might realize?
I think that there probably is. And I think it's a lack of communication and sort of education on the part of the non-doomers, right? So the people like AOC have a big platform. They're really good at communicating their ideas and their solutions. And I think we have to be willing to meet these people where they are and communicate with them in a language that makes sense to them. So instead of dismissing their concerns and saying, well, that's not actually going to happen, look at the data, we need to talk to them in a way that kind of validates their concerns, but then points them gently to sort of the data that could assuage some of their concerns. And also, and again, I think a message of optimism over time will win out over a message of pessimism. So I think treating that generation with respect and respecting their concerns, but putting forward more practical solutions that aren't as costly and inefficient as sort of the AOC platform is, I think over time that could be successful.
Great. Jeff, why don't we turn to you for a minute? Tell me about, voter attitudes just generally on clean energy. Obviously our sister organization C4 Action did a poll on this recently. Do you want to talk a little bit about what voters are really thinking about this issue?
Yeah. I think short answer is voters overwhelmingly are in favor of clean energy. A Pew Research poll from March found that about 70% of voters are in favor of advancing, wind, solar, and other renewable technologies. And they're also in favor of the United States taking steps towards decarbonization. But importantly, about 67% of these respondents said that that the U.S. should accomplish these goals while keeping fossil fuels in the energy mix. And then the C3 Action poll that you referenced, it found that 68% of respondents are in favor of an all the above, tech neutral support, that advances nuclear power, renewables, and, fossil fuels too. And that poll also found, a serious appetite for energy to be not only reliable, but also affordable. So I think voters in general are, very supportive of clean energy, and they're especially supportive of domestically produced clean energy that's, reliable and affordable.
Yeah, and I think another finding in our poll that jumped out to me was, we asked, of Republican voters, do you favor candidates who talk about climate change? And that's the word climate change is one of those kind of loaded words, obviously on the right, because the left has seized it and used it really to talk not just about the environment, or the planet, but it's really about power. It's about using that concern that Kat touched on to mobilize people around a lot of unrelated goals that have little to do with the environment. But we found that of voters 18 to 24, about 2/3 said climate change was very important to their vote. Overall, voters actually in primaries prefer Republicans to talk about climate change than not, which seems counterintuitive to some folks. But only 42% of people over 65 preferred that. But again, it gets to my point at the opening that what we think of as the base is really changing. And so tomorrow's electorate is going to look a lot different than today's. We also found that about 78% of voters 18 to 24 are willing to pay more for goods and services, which is about twice as many as people over 65. Only about 39% said they'd be willing to pay more. So again, there's a generational divide here, but I think it's smart to kind of organize and build our policies around, an electorate that's going to support where I think a lot of us want to go. So on that note, Ben, why don't you talk a little bit about just the partisan nature of this issue, and whether it should be partisan, and what are some conservatives that you really admire or think are champions of the issue of clean energy?
Sure. So I think it's absolutely a myth that clean energy is a partisan issue. And I think the best clean energy asset that we have is nuclear power. And Republicans have been consistently more in favor of nuclear power than Democrats. A Gallup poll from May of this year showed 60% of Republicans being in favor of nuclear, compared to just 39% of Democrats. And this is seemingly paradoxical. A clean energy source that operates 24/7, 365, providing reliable baseload power. You think you'd say that, and Democrats would jump on it as a panacea for climate change, but you don't see that in polling and support for nuclear energy. And I think you're also seeing an age gap among Republicans. Younger Republicans are much more supportive of clean energy than their older counterparts, just as they're more likely to believe in human-caused climate change. A Pew survey from May found that 64% of Republicans 18 to 29 think power companies should be required to use more renewables, compared to just 42% of Republicans 65 and older. So I think focusing on nuclear energy as a clean and reliable baseload power source is something that Republicans have been championing for a long time. And to their credit, Democrats have started to catch on, but are still farther behind than we need them to be. I think is an absolute winner when it comes to bipartisan approaches to clean energy. And in terms of conservatives that I think are really championing clean energy, got to rep for ACC, of course. The folks at ACC are doing great work. Benji, of course. Benji Backer's doing an awesome job showing that young conservatives can be for conservation and free market approaches to combating climate change and transitioning to clean energy. And on the Hill, you see folks like Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming. He's a big advocate for nuclear energy. He's proposed establishing a strategic uranium reserve to incentivize domestic uranium production, and also backs permitting reform for advanced next generation nuclear reactors like small modular reactors. And then you have folks like Kathy McMorris Rogers of Washington, a great advocate for hydropower too, a lot of hydropower facilities in her state, and wants to streamline licensing of new projects and protect existing facilities as well.
That's great. Yeah, and there's more than we can even cover here. There's Bruce Westerman, who's from Arkansas. He's a forester. So I'm sitting on 62 acres. So I've got a farm about an hour outside of DC. So planted over 1,000 trees, and Benji's group ACC's helped plant some of those trees as well. He has a great team in DC here, Chris Barnhart and Quill Robinson, a lot of others. But there's other members all over the country that I think are understanding that voters want to know what people are for. I've worked on lots of different issue sets in my time in politics, healthcare, upward mobility. And one thing that comes across consistently is that it really does matter if you have a plan. It's true that not everybody's going to look at the details. Not everybody's going to wonk out on all the minutia, but it does matter that there's something under the hood that works. And so I think our worldview, again, we promote economic freedom at C3 Solutions as really the foundational concept. Nick Loris did a great paper that said free economies are twice as clean as less free economies. So in other words, economies where you have lower taxes, less government, less spending, smart regulations end up producing much better environmental outcomes than countries that don't. So you're right that it isn't just a one-sided discussion anymore. There's the real competition of ideas. And you touched a little bit too on permitting and how important that is. And we've seen obviously this week, there was an effort, Senator Manchin, supposedly in exchange for his vote on the Inflation Reduction Act, which again, I take strong exception to that title because it was really about expanding federal power, doubling, the IRS workforce, which we don't need to be doing. We need to be expanding the potential of America's entrepreneurs and innovators, not hiring more tax minders to harass them and bully them into compliance and conduct audits. So I take great exception to that bill for lots of reasons. But in exchange for that, Senator Schumer said he could have a vote on permitting reform. And I think what ended up being on the floor was not really robust permitting. It was kind of permitting in name only. So we could all get into that a little bit. But Jeff, why don't we turn to you? And why don't you talk a little bit more about, where we need to go, what was and wasn't in that bill. But I think, but permitting is a key issue that younger folks care about, but really people of all ages.
Yeah. So I think, before we kind of talk about that bill, we kind of have to understand the issue and what needed to be addressed. And that is permitting in the United States. The current system is, extremely antiquated and burdensome. And the largest reason why really is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA for short. And while it was well-intentioned to protect the environment, it was also signed into law in 1970. And since then, it's just become more complicated and more bureaucratic. So in order for a project to start, it must first go through NEPA, a NEPA review to determine whether or not the project's going to have a significant impact on the environment. And while that's, a really good goal, we shouldn't, be trashing our environment. The process takes a while to complete. On average, it's about 4.5 years. So that, delays projects by a while. It costs millions of dollars to complete. And ironically, it impacts clean energy projects more than fossil fuel related ones. And then another part of the NEPA process is litigation. So environmental groups can threaten to sue energy projects that they don't like with NEPA litigation. And that's just been a deterrent to any environmental or infrastructure related progress. So really what was needed was comprehensive reform, which Manchin's proposal didn't quite do.
Right. But yeah, why don't we go to each of you? Ben, maybe you could touch on, what actually was in Manchin's proposal and what you think a better alternative would look like.
Sure. So to his credit, I think there were a lot of really good things in Manchin's proposal. For example, setting a 2-year time limit for reviews of major projects under NEPA, a 150-day statute of limitations for lawsuits over projects to ensure that we're able to expedite and streamline construction. But there were a lot of negatives as well. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is the Manchin bill would have given PERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, authority over transmission lines going through states. It would have taken away the sovereignty of states to decide whether those transmission lines are good for them. And it would have given FERC almost sole authority to dictate that if they believed it was in the nation's interest. So when you compare the Manchin bill, which as you mentioned, had some good things, but really lacked the teeth to truly streamline construction projects, to his West Virginia colleague, Senator Shelley Moore Capito, has her own bill that has a lot more teeth than this and doesn't include that unhelpful, I would say, FERC transmission line component. And Senator Capito did say she was willing to support the Manchin bill, but seeing that it's been tabled, I hope that Republicans and sensible Democrats will coalesce around Capito's bill and give permitting the reform that it so desperately needs. And I think also both of them agreed, and to Manchin's credit, that there's one project in particular, obviously very close to Senator Capito and Senator Manchin, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which goes through West Virginia, that's been held up for quite a while because of environmental impact concerns. Both bills would seek to authorize that immediately and get that finished, get that up and running. So I think those, so long as those key tenets are kept in, I think the Capito bill will just do more than the Manchin bill, and I hope the Manchin will support the Capito bill in turn.
Right, that's great. And Kat, why don't you talk a little bit about, Jeff mentioned this too, but how inefficient permitting can actually hurt more than help clean energy, and that clean energy is actually very susceptible to kind of an irrational permitting regime. What are some other projects maybe that you're familiar with that have been stalled by this, and feel free to talk more about the work that PERC has done outstanding work in this area. So why don't you touch on some of those topics?
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of as we've noted here, kind of the debate around permitting reform has really focused on energy and infrastructure. But it actually has a direct impact on conservation, especially in the context of forest management and wildfire. Out here in the West, where I'm located, PERC is located in Bozeman, Montana, and in sort of across the Western United States. We've been seeing hotter, more intense wildfires burning every season. And that's largely the result of a century of fire suppression policy that sort of distorted natural fire cycles and led to a buildup of fuel in our forests, which created unnatural conditions that have made our forests actually less resilient to wildfire. So there's sort of a broad consensus across kind of the conservation forest management community that we need to do more active restoration in our forests to reduce fuel loads and sort of return our forests to a more natural, healthier fire cycle. So part of the way to do that is to increase the pace and scale of projects like mechanical thinning and prescribed fire. And unfortunately, this sort of overly bureaucratic environmental review process stands in the way of that. So some recent research published by PERC found that on average, a mechanical thinning project is delayed by about 3.6 years from the time the environmental review process is initiated to the time work can actually begin. It takes 3.6 years. And for prescribed fire, the average is 4.7 years. Now, if those projects require more stringent review, known as an environmental impact statement under NEPA or an EIS, those averages tick up to over 5 years for mechanical thinning and over 9 years for prescribed fire. And then if you throw litigation into the mix, these projects can be delayed by a decade or more. And that has very real consequences for ecosystems and communities that sort of lay in these fire-prone areas. For example, the community of Grizzly Flats last summer, that's a community sort of in the mountains of California and the Sierra Nevada. That community had known that there was severe fire risk. The private lands that were managed in that area were treated, but the Forest Service land had been planned to be treated, but was delayed by over a decade. And the Caldor fire of 2021 wound up ripping through that area, through the vulnerable sort of southern flank of the Forest Service managed land, and it wound up burning that community to the ground. So delaying these projects has very real sort of immediate impacts on Western communities every wildfire season. So if we actually want to get a handle on the wildfire crisis and increase the pace and scale of forest restoration, we absolutely have to address the bureaucratic delays that stem from environmental reviews.
Yeah, that's just a fascinating and troubling phenomenon. So there's incredible opportunities to make vast improvements in that system. Why don't we touch a little bit on the issue of Europe and Ukraine and Russia? So, I've written about this a lot, and we've covered this extensively at C3. But like it or not, Russia is really waging an energy war. Jeff, why don't you talk about maybe some of the lessons as we're in the middle of Clean Energy Week? What are some of the lessons that we can take from how energy has played into the conflict in Ukraine and apply those to the situation here in America?
Yeah. So in 2011, Germany began to decommission their nuclear plants and their natural gas infrastructure and pursue, an only renewable energy strategy. This was government-led, not market-driven. So of course it had some issues. While renewables are good, you need baseload power like nuclear power, like fossil fuels, like natural gas, for whenever the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So Germany completely decommissioned that internally, and Europe soon followed suit. But in order to get that baseload power, they turned to Russia and Russian natural gas, which, as we can all probably assume, Putin's probably not the best person to get in bed with. So Germany essentially compromised their energy security in the name of virtue signaling that they were, reducing their emissions better than anyone else. But with that, they then turned to Russia, who obviously used that leverage to wage a war on Ukraine. So whenever Russia invaded Ukraine, that sent energy markets in Europe into a frenzy. And it's really had devastating impacts. Germany, for instance, there's towns in Germany that the mayors are asking their citizens to reduce hot water usage and reduce hot showers. Spain is worried that they won't have enough energy at peak demand hours for the economy to thrive. So it's really had devastating impacts, and there's a lot of lessons that we can learn. I think one thing is the importance of energy security in any strategy that you pursue, any climate strategy specifically. by completely negating their own domestic energy production. Germany has let Russia, who has higher pollutants, completely control them. Another thing is an all of the above approach. You know, if you have a diverse energy strategy, you're less susceptible to bad actors and bad play. And also American fossil fuels, you know, they are more cleanly produced than anyone else. And if you stop production domestically, that's not going to, you know, stifle demand. Emerging economies are always going to need the fossil fuels. It's just going to shift production overseas to dirtier producing countries, which again is going to hurt our energy security. So I think American policymakers, they need to, you know, have a holistic view on this. They need to let markets pick the energy winners and losers, and they can do that, and they can reduce emissions at the same time.
Yeah, I think, and one of the reasons that Europe became more dependent upon other sources of energy is Germany in particular. They started to shut down their own nuclear plants, and that's, you know, that's an energy source where what's so, and Ben touched on this before, that what's a lot of folks kind of Generation X and older, just it's a head scratcher, because if the left really believes that we face this cataclysmic risk of climate change, you know, and to borrow the Leonardo DiCaprio analogy of Don't Look Up, you know, the asteroid, the metaphorical asteroid headed towards Earth, if we really wanted to deal with that and dramatically lower the risk of climate change, we could go nuclear very, very quickly, and it would be expensive. But Kerry Emanuel at MIT has actually written a piece called Nuclear Salvation. And he estimates that for the net cost of about $100 billion a year, we could shift most of the world's coal plants to nuclear. That wouldn't, quote, solve everything, but it would dramatically reduce the risk of some kind of a catastrophic ecosystem collapse situation. So it seems like there's more openness, and again, the polls show this, among younger Americans to embrace nuclear energy. There's kind of an old legacy reaction against, you know, those of us, I'm old enough to remember, you know, the Cold War and being afraid of nuclear war. Of course, that the risk of that is now greater than at any time since I was a kid, really in part because of criminally insane left-wing energy policy that has made us more dependent on dictators, and while we demonize American energy production. So the debate has a lot of just inconsistency within it. But maybe if Ben and Kat, if you could talk, and Jeff, any more about really where you see nuclear power headed. You know, what are the barriers? What are some of the private sector options coming up? Small modular nuclear reactors. You know, could there be a time in my lifetime when I have all this land? Could I put a small modular nuclear reactor, you know, on my own land and help power, you know, a large chunk of territory here? Anybody want to weigh in on that one?
Sure, yeah, and I'll let Ben sort of speak to the nuclear, the small modular reactors and kind of the innovation that's happening there. But I think it's just worth noting, reiterating kind of the benefits of nuclear energy, because John, I'm pleased to hear that you think young people are more open to it, and perhaps there's data to suggest that. But in a lot of the conversations I have, there still seems to be kind of this legacy of fear around the technology. And so I think it's just worth noting that, you know, it really is not just the best, but like the only real alternative to fossil fuels. You know, we can talk about pairing renewables with baseload sources like natural gas and nuclear that are cleaner, but that system actually kind of undermines the competitiveness of the baseload energy sources. So I don't know how sustainable that is long term. So if we really want to transition from fossil fuels, I think nuclear really is our only option.
Yeah, and let me just pause you just to spell out, because sometimes because we're so used to this issue, is you know, the fundamental differences between solar and wind are intermittent, and that's the key point that is often missed. Is the sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing, whereas nuclear gives us the capacity to have that baseload. So again, that's just an obvious point, but I just wanted to be clear for listeners that that's why we're talking about nuclear in this way.
Absolutely, yeah. So it produces energy more reliably, to your point, because it's not intermittent. It can produce rain or shine. And it also is power dense. I think that's another really critical point to note. That means it requires vastly less land to produce the same amount of power that, you know, a solar or wind farm can produce. And it also produces significantly less waste, which is kind of a misconception about nuclear. When you compare it to a solar, for example, nuclear produces 300 times less waste per unit of electricity than a solar panel does. So there's, again, kind of been this decades-long campaign rooted in the Cold War, rooted in fear over nuclear annihilation, sort of this decades-long campaign of against nuclear. But really, a lot of the concerns are kind of unfounded. You know, the safety concern, when you look at actual data, far more people have died from burning biomass and fossil fuels and have died from nuclear accidents. You know, over the course of the technology's life, only, you know, I think just under 100 people have died from nuclear accidents, whereas by some estimates, you know, over 4 million people have died in a single year of premature deaths because of burning, you know, biomass and fossil fuels. So it is actually quite safe when you look at its real record. And then in terms of the waste issue, yes, it does produce waste that remains radioactive for thousands of years, but a crucial point that's often overlooked is that the degree of that radioactivity actually diminishes significantly just within a mere decade. Plus, again, it produces less waste, and that waste is stored in steel vessels set in concrete above ground in a secure building. So it's actually quite manageable, and the risk of it seeping into groundwater is sort of virtually impossible. So it really is this great alternative, and Ben can speak to this, but sort of the new reactor designs have improved, so the safety is even better than it was, you know, decades ago. So we really have to move. I think we need a rebranding of nuclear energy, right? And I think we need to do a better job of educating, especially these you know, younger generations about the benefits of nuclear and how safe nuclear actually is. And in terms of what stands in the way of making nuclear more competitive, I generally am not supportive of the idea that it just needs more government subsidies. Admittedly, I'm a libertarian, so I'm sort of opposed to all government subsidies. And I'm sure, you know, other people who are advocates of nuclear would probably disagree with me on that point and would want more public investment. But I think something that other nuclear activists would agree with me on is that we also have to consider how we regulate that industry. So this sort of culture of fear around nuclear has led us to over-regulate it, and that has real costs, and that has made the industry less competitive. One example of this is the regulatory body that regulates nuclear, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That commission is basically paid by the time it takes to approve a new facility, not the number of new facilities that they approve. So built into their model is an incentive to slow walk the approval of new facilities. Now, I'm not arguing that we cut corners, of course, but when it takes over a decade to bring a new facility online, I think we have to pause and rethink how we regulate the industry, because if we stay on this same path with the status quo, it's not going to be competitive.
Right. That's terrific. Ben, any thoughts you'd like to share on nuclear energy?
So many thoughts. Where do I even start? So I'll share two fun facts, and then I'll move on to the benefits of SMRs and advanced reactors. So Kat did a great job of talking about nuclear waste. Frankly, I don't even think we should call it waste anymore, because 96% of it can be recycled into usable nuclear fuel. France already does this. And for context, France receives 70% of their total electricity from nuclear, and 17% of their total electricity comes from nuclear using recycled fuel cells. Now, the US doesn't recycle our fuel, unfortunately, but it's clearly technically feasible. And that's something we should absolutely implement. And to give you all more context for the amount of waste produced, all of the nuclear waste, I keep saying waste, all of the used nuclear fuel, byproduct, that's a great word for it, could produced by the US nuclear industry in the past 70 years could fill a football field at a depth of less than 10 yards. It is not that much. And that's because of the amazing energy density of nuclear and of uranium. A single uranium fuel pellet, It's about the size of my thumb there, has as much energy potential as 1 ton of coal. That's incredible. So moving on to SMRs, which are small modular reactors, they're smaller than your average nuclear plant, and they can be factory built and shipped to their eventual location, which makes it a heck of a lot less of an upfront capital investment to produce. And obviously the timeline is a lot shorter.
Let me pause you on. When you talk about size, we're talking, in the movie, 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl, we're talking huge facilities, whereas a small modular is, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're talking half an acre ballpark, or more or less.
Yeah, more or less. And there's kind of a difference between like a small modular reactor and something called even a micro reactor, which can literally be put on an 18-wheeler and shipped to a location. So there's a realm of possibilities. And so you did mention, John, the coal to nuclear possibility. This is something that I've been focusing on recently. The Department of Energy recently released a report that said that 80% of the current and formerly operating coal plants are suitable locations to host advanced reactors. And that's for a number of reasons. They already have transmission lines built for coal plants that we can easily connect an SMR to, existing rail connections, ample water resources, and to me, most importantly, labor forces that have lost their jobs due to the coal industry's decline that can be easily retrained, or in some cases, not even that much retraining is required, because many jobs at a nuclear plant are very similar to that of a coal plant. So I think nuclear is, just very specifically a better choice to help coal communities replace the jobs lost than, for example, wind or solar. Solar could only replace 62%, for example, of coal community locations, and wind could only replace 7%. And the reasons for that are obvious. You can't really put wind turbines in a lot of places in Appalachia and West Virginia. I mean, Wyoming is sort of a good location for it, but still, even the incomes, the wages that they provide are significantly lower than that of a nuclear plant, of an advanced reactor. And I know you also mentioned what are the biggest challenges facing SMR. So there's quite a few. I'll touch on one for now. It's the fuel. So traditional nuclear reactors use uranium that is enriched to about 5%. Small modular reactors, because they're smaller, you need to be able to generate more energy and in a smaller, more confined space. And that requires you to enrich your uranium past 5%. So they use fuel that's called HALEU, and that's high assay, low enriched uranium. And we were just talking about Russia. Not only does Russia provide 14% of our traditional uranium, they provide 100% currently of the world's HALEU, 100%. That's a serious concern if we want to build out our advanced reactor fleet. Now, there has been, to its credits, the Inflation Reduction Act, which may or may not actually reduce inflation, but that's separate to its benefits to the nuclear industry. It does provide $700 million for domestic HALEU production, which is great. Senator John Barrasso, his proposal to establish a strategic uranium reserve to boost production is a positive step in the right direction as well. But that is a big obstacle that we need to start enriching this HALEU as soon as we can in order to get our advanced reactor fleet online. And I think it's absolutely a national security imperative. I mean, as Jeff mentioned, if Germany wouldn't have shut off their nuclear plants, they wouldn't likely be facing down a cold winter without power right now. And you just saw, oh my gosh, Nord Stream was sabotaged, which was absolutely crazy. So they might not even have any gas at all left. And so I think nuclear as a national security asset, seeing it as a way to protect and ensure our energy independence, is absolutely vital, because nuclear, one of the pieces that I wrote, which was very punny, was you can have your yellow cake and eat it too, because nuclear solves climate and economic goals simultaneously.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, so we got just a few minutes left, and a couple of questions have come in. One is from Grant. The question is, to what extent are young people's concerns over climate change a function of the fact that they're not old enough to have the same economic issues that older generations have at stake? For example, they may not have full-time jobs or families to support yet. If that's the case, then might we expect younger people to shift their concerns as they age? So how much of the gaps into sort of voter attitudes do you think are because of, as this listener suggests, or just, age, transition, life season changes, if you will?
I can go. I think that's actually a really good point. And, maybe as you get older, you have more financial responsibilities. You can maybe dedicate less time to certain things. But I think one reason that maybe older generations are skeptical of climate change and the climate movement is that for so long, all the solutions that were proposed coincided with kind of recessions, or, it wasn't good economic policy. But, as we're showing with the nuclear discussion, with energy security, with American fuel production, you can have good climate policy and good economic policy. So I'm really optimistic that younger generations can kind of see that. They can, as they get older, as they have more financial responsibility, they can still care about the environment. They can still care about climate change, because really what's going to win this is economic freedom and it's innovation. And I think those go hand in hand with reducing emissions.
I'll just also add that we've, my generation and generations younger than me have grown up in an era of abundance. And we haven't really had to make the sacrifices that are required when you don't have reliable energy. And we're kind of, sadly getting a glimpse of that in Europe. And if you live in the People's Republic of California, you're living with that as well. And so I think, unfortunately, we're kind of due for some hard life lessons that I think will put these issues in perspective and help my generation and younger generations recognize that, not to be the cliche libertarian, but to quote Thomas Sowell, there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about energy policy, we have to think about the costs and the benefits of each energy source and put human health and prosperity at the center of that calculation. So I think going forward, as sort of we learn more and we have more life experience and we face more harder, more difficult decisions, I think we'll get more practical about this issue.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I think something that I've just lived through is that I think it isn't so much age as it is having skin in the game. Where when you become a property owner, you own a house, you own a small part of land. Now I've gone from half an acre yard to 62 acres. I can tell you that I understand and care a lot more about private property rights when I am personally responsible for managing forest land, farmland, and I see the implication of and the consequences of bad policy. And so that gets me. I mean, I could go off. I won't go off on that right now, but I want to be driving that bus, as the property owner. And I think the more we can give and empower the agency of individuals and less federal agencies, I think the better off we're going to be. Just one final question. Just got about a minute left. This is a good wrap-up question. This person says, one of the reasons that many conservatives and libertarians have become skeptical of climate change is because the policies were always rooted in top-down approaches, regulations, mandates, and restrictions on consumer choice, like don't eat meat or you must drive other electric vehicles. Is that a concern among younger generations, and how do you all address that issue? So we'll just go around. Anybody wants to touch on that?
Yeah, I can take that. So Pew asked a question, do you think technological advancements will be able to solve climate change, or rather, do you believe that major lifestyle changes will be needed to address problems from climate change? So 51% of US adults said that major lifestyle changes are needed, 51% of Gen Z, but it actually seemingly paradoxically gets higher once you go to millennials, 56%, 52% of Gen X thinks major lifestyle changes will be needed. And I think, and I'm just going to take this opportunity to malign my least favorite political philosophy, which is the idea of degrowth. It's a weird Malthusian idea that we need to go back in time and put more people into poverty in order to combat climate change. And we don't need to do that. And I'm obviously touting nuclear, but we absolutely can continue progressing as a society while also meeting climate and conservation goals. And I think you're absolutely right to the person who asked this top-down approach of going backwards has, rightly so, turned a lot of people off. But I think if we message it correctly, we say, look, you don't have to sacrifice all of the great things about living in America and having, I think Kat mentioned this, the benefits of abundance. We can continue having abundant energy and a high standard of living if we use nuclear as our baseload. Don't eat meat, drive EVs. I think those are sometimes unfair, especially not eating meat, I think is unfairly tied to the argument of clean energy. Like, we don't need to really worry about meat consumption if we just switched, like we could switch to nuclear and cut emissions significantly while also ensuring we have a reliable, affordable, clean, safe baseload energy source. So I think just that messaging that you can have your yellow cake and eat it too is
you can have your
the most
cheeseburger and yellow cake and eat it.
And I love cheeseburgers.
So I like that branding idea. We can like merge nuclear, hamburgers, cake. That's good. We've arrived here.
The whole meal.
Some innovation. Well, guys, this has been a great discussion. So again, my name's John Hart. This has been a discussion about younger voter attitudes on clean energy and climate. And Kat, Ben, Jeff, thanks so much for joining us. We'll have a link to this in our newsletter. You can go to our news magazine, c3newsmag.com. You can sign up for our email list, and we'll send this around and have links also to all the panelists, their information, and organizations too, so you can follow their good work. And thanks again, and we'll look forward to another lively discussion.